Thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to use a PowerPoint presentation. This is the technology you may recall was blamed in part by an official government report on destroying the culture of excellence at NASA. And so let me, and also this is a talk that's designed to take 45 minutes. I'm going to do it in 20, so let me speed quickly through. My thesis is that there's a symbiotic relationship between science and liberalism. Let me quickly define my terms. By science, I mean what sometimes is called modern science, which is to say the entire social institution of a scientific establishment that has professional scientists, university departments, laboratories, refereed journals, scientific conferences, and all the rest of it. In the book, I'm not concerned with how science originated or why it happened to originate, when and where it did. I think any tool-making species that keeps tool-making to a certain critical point will inevitably develop science, but that's not part of the argument here today. What I do want to avoid is going back and cherry-picking the occasional scholar who did something that today looks scientific and attributing great scientific achievements to that time and place. That's interesting historically, but it's not very helpful when you're looking at the interaction of science and democracies today. There's never been in history anything like the scientific establishment we have today. And it does have a method, despite the efforts of hundreds of scholars to claim otherwise. And the essence of this method is a kind of feedback loop. You have an idea, and instead of just testing it either by its internal logic or by testing it against other competing ideas, which Aristotle had identified as the only two ways to evaluate an idea before science, you conduct an experiment. And based on, and that's where the tools come in, you do have to have a technology. And then based on the experiment, you might affirm, revise, or deny the hypothesis. That really is how science works, as far as I can tell, in 40 years of covering it, even though many people seem to think otherwise. Now, quickly give you an example. Paul Dirac in 1928 writes an equation that accurately describes the behavior of the electron in every respect. It's a beautiful piece of work, but it implies that there ought to be an anti-electron, something no one had ever heard of. Dirac is embarrassed by the prediction, tries to make as little of it as possible. Therefore, Carl Anderson, when he discovers the antimatter component, counterpart of the electron, doesn't even know that the prediction was in Dirac's paper of just a few years earlier. Consequently, the prediction is affirmed. Now, by liberalism, I have in mind classical, what is sometimes called classical liberalism. In my opinion, liberalism, like science, is not a term that benefits from modifiers. I don't think there's any need to talk about modern science or classical liberalism. To me, liberalism is just liberalism. It's enshrined in the Bill of Rights and so forth. And so when I talk about it, that's what I mean. Now, one reason I think that Americans have had problems figuring out where various opinions like liberalism might lie on the political spectrum is that for some reason we have a tradition of looking at politics in terms of a one-dimensional left-to-right spectrum. In science, you can, one dimensions, it's sort of like the questions that involve favorites, like what's your favorite such and such means take this entire field and reduce it to one dimension and then tell me what lies on one end of it. Who's the greatest athlete in the world? That's a one-dimensional analysis. You can't get a satisfactory answer because it's not enough dimensions. This happens all the time. This, for instance, is a one-dimensional version of a photograph. If you just add a dimension, it looks like that. So in science, it's quite common to take problems and say, maybe the confusion here is that we don't have enough dimensions. Let's just add one. And often in science, you can go to 10, 24 dimensions. In mathematics, they go to 10,000 or more dimensions. Here, I would just revive the old idea that it's better to look at politics in two dimensions. Hayek had a diagram like this. There are many of them now on the internet. The details of the diagram don't matter. This one opposes progressive conservative and liberal totalitarian. You might want to construct one for yourself. I just think you're much better off starting with two dimensions than one and trying to understand political orientations. Now, liberalism does have in common with science that, at least in terms of liberal democracy, one constructs experiments they are inherent to the system. Every election is an experiment. Every act of legislation is an experiment. This isn't the way we talk about it so much now, but the founders did talk in experimental terms. Jefferson's second inaugural is one of the many documents using the term experiment overtly to talk about American independence. And he points out that, particularly with regard to freedom of speech, seldom has anyone been as pilloried as I've been for 4 years by the press, and yet not only the administration survived, we even got reelected. It was an experimental process. To make the loop work in scientific terms, you need to analyze the results, and we haven't been always so good at that in the liberal democracies. There's a tendency to do the first two steps and leave a lot of programs that aren't working still around. And there has been effort in government on various levels to improve this third step. The U.S. Department of Education, for instance, has been spending increasing amounts of money to evaluate what works and what doesn't work. Science and liberalism are symbiotic, I would say, in that both are authoritarian, self-correcting, powerful social activities that require maximizing intellectual resources. That is, they both put a stress on universal public education, which has been a principle of liberalism from the beginning. Now, I argue historically that science incited the Enlightenment, and there's some various dates here that if we had more time I would go into with you, but I'll spare you this time. I would just like to note the amusing fact that newspapers essentially began in large measure to report the earliest scientific discoveries, particularly Galileo's observations. Coffee was also coming into Europe from Turkey, and the result was a combination of newspapers and coffee houses which proved seditious in every jurisdiction in which they arose. Every leader from Cairo to London sought to suppress coffee houses because once you get people starting to drink coffee, read the papers, and talk, they discover that it's not just them that thinks the government is off base. And all those efforts failed, fortunately. This combination of science and liberalism has quite a number of attainments. In the book, I try to boil down some of them to what I think are fairly universal values. What can everyone agree it's good for people to have, like health, wealth, and happiness? In terms of health, we, thanks to science and free enterprise and such, the average expectation of a baby born in the world today is more than twice what it was in 1800. Food production is up 52% per person despite the increase in population just since 1961, and that's actually just to 2001. And the reason, of course, for that is that agriculture is much more productive. It's not productive because some scientific council got together and made up a set of precepts that were then carried out. It's productive because of experimentation. And that's what I've tried to emphasize in The Science of Liberty is the important aspect of science. It's not just that it's rational. Lots of things are rational. It's that science is experimental. And it was agricultural experimentation that brought about these gains. In terms of wealth, well, you know, the world per capita GDP circa 1800 was around $700 a year. Growth rate was under 1%. 2008, it was over 6,000. I think it's roughly 7,000 now. Growth rate, not including the recent financial troubles, of around 3%. That's an amazing accomplishment, despite the considerable increase in population during that same period. Happiness is hard to measure. One thing I looked at is literacy, because it's clearly people are better off if they can read or write and feel better off and more in contact with the world and their community. World literacy went from 63% in 1970, up 10% by 1985, and over 80% today. Now, if you were sitting in a coffee house in 1700 in London, let's say on Change Alley, where a lot of the science-minded people would gather, and you were all science aficionados and you were trying to guess what the future might bring, you might have been, you know, Francis Bacon did this. This was a guy who was smart enough that a lot of people think he was Shakespeare. Francis Bacon saw some of what was coming with science and tried to predict it, and it's very difficult to do. It's hard to make predictions, as Niels Bohr said, especially about the future. Had you said at such an assembly that by somewhere around 2000 or so, 80% of the entire human population will be literate.